Okay, I think we can get started while the last people are coming in. Welcome to Club Ev Med. My name is Bernie Crespi. I'll be hosting today. Again, welcome to Club Ev Med Conversations. The goal of these meetings is to connect the evolutionary medicine community and share and discuss exciting new research. We try to make this as informal as possible, with emphasis on questions and discussion and presentation of different perspectives. Club EvMed is organized by the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health. If you are not a member, and raise your hand if you are a member. Thank you. If you're not a member, now is an excellent time to join. Also a good time to renew. Please support the society as well by submitting articles to the journal Evolution Medicine and Public Health. Club EvMed is also organized by now 8 evolution and health centers and programs. And Johnny, if you put those into the chat, that's great. The newest of these are at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the University of Kiel in Germany, and Vanderbilt University in the USA. The process today is to get everyone to participate in the conversation. You can post questions and ideas into the chat box during the presentation, and you can also raise your hand anytime. And Michael has said he will take questions during the talk, or otherwise we'll just have them. We'll have them at the end. Also, feel free to tweet or X or whatever you call it using hashtag #ClubEvMed. This presentation is the second in the series, What are translated wins for evolutionary medicine, and how do we achieve more of them? The speaker today is Michael Muehlenbein, professor and chair at the Department of Anthropology at Baylor University. I won't go through his entire biography. I don't want to take time away from his talk, but just to hit a few high points. He has worked in 11 countries, published over 100 papers, and served as an organizer for the international meetings of the Evolution Medicine and Public Health group. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bernie. Generous introduction. Hi, everybody. I appreciate you giving me part of your Saturday. I'm already on the weekend, right? Gosh, getting ahead of myself. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's nice to see a lot of you again. Saw some in California a few months ago, and I imagine I'll see hopefully the rest of you in Durham next year. So what I'd like to talk about is a series of projects that I did originally as a side gig. Most of my work has been in ecological immunology, hormone-mediated immune responses and trade-offs. But when I finished my last degree in 2004, I wanted to maintain time in the field. And so I ended up establishing a relationship with people who worked at the Sepalok Orangutan Rehabilitation Center in Sabah, Malaysian Borneo. And it was there that I was able to expand my interests in One Health, and actually my first master's degree is in tropical medicine, and applying that for understanding disease transmission between humans and non-human primates. So I don't need to belabor to this group what One Health is or why it's important. If you Google One Health just for the images, I find it amusing that almost all of them are this triad of non-human, human, and environment health, and they're all connected. My preferred graphic is the cover of a coloring book that is produced by the CDC on One Health. So as these projects evolved, the survey work behind it became more sophisticated and drawing on information from a number of different fields, where it's ethnoprimatology, conservation medicine, which seems to be interchangeably used as One Health or Eco Health. The contribution of travel medicine, because as I'll explain, my interest has been in disease exposure associated with tourism or travel. Biophilia and understanding, the natural tendencies to emotionally affiliate with natural systems. E.O. Wilson, 1984. And then combined with an understanding that as a species, we originally evolved to interact with our environment through the somatosensory system of touch. Right? And then most recently, trying to understand juxtaposed behaviors in people as they attempt to justify doing things that put themselves and other species at risk. So if we were to connect some dots, these are my dots, starting with the idea that most of you know, 75% of EIDs, non-human animal source. Wildlife serve as reservoirs of pathogens, but they're also susceptible to human pathogens, particularly non-human primates that are genetically closely related to us, immunologically naive to a lot of our pathogens. Yet we're drawn to these animals, right? We're drawn to these animals to have direct contact, and during travel, that becomes quite significant. Illness during travel is rather common. Knowledge, attitudes, and practices, that's KAP, what you know, what you believe, and how that influences your behavior. And travelers overall is rather poor. And this is also combined with, during travel, you get a general loss of inhibition, loss of situational awareness. This is why people die taking selfies, right? So all of this means that there's a lot of opportunity for human, non-human animal contact. Just to give an example, we did an analysis using the GeoSentinel system, collaboration between the CDC and the International Society for Travel Medicine. And that's a clinic-based system of 72 sites around the globe. And within an 11-year period, we documented 6,470 animal exposures, 5,687 that required post-exposure prophylaxis for rabies. That is, of course, only within that GeoSentinel system. So it's the tip of the iceberg. And it's not necessarily just in exotic places or animal sanctuaries. It's all over the place and involves many different species, from coatis and squirrels and deer to lions and bison in the US, elephants. But it also goes both ways. So yes, travel increases our likelihood of exposure to animals and us being injured, but we are doing our fair share of causing injury ourselves, which is problematic, right? So this is physical injury, but I've been interested in the likelihood of spillover, pathogen exchange, particularly with non-human primates. Again, reason being that they're closest living relatives, they tend to be threatened, their species in general, conservation status, and they're immunologically naive to us. And if we look through even just very recent history over the past 20 years, we see a number of zoonotic pathogens that have come into the human population from non-human primates. This is just an example. And then the same for anthroponoses from, to wild primates from humans. These are anthroponoses, anthropozoonoses, or reverse zoonoses, many different terms for these. So this disease exchange both ways, spill over and spill back, happens through a number of mechanisms, right? Happens associated with the pet trade. Obviously, it happens association with bushmeat. I would, again, back in 2007, I was working in Malaysian Borneo at an orangutan sanctuary to set up a health monitoring program. And a lot of the work on zoonotic diseases associated with non-human primates is happening in Africa at that time and typically associated with bushmeat. But in Malaysian Borneo, it's primarily Muslim, so we weren't seeing a lot of bushmeat. What we were seeing was a lot of tourism. So people intentionally coming to have this intimate contact with non-human primates. You can see Thailand here. These two images are not mine, the others are. Bali, Arashiyama, Japan, Jikokudani with the famous onsens. But you don't have to go that far either. Trentham Monkey Park in the UK allows direct contact. So I began collecting survey data now from 7 different countries. The 7th on there, Thailand, is not listed because the data have not been analyzed yet. But starting back in 2007 in Malaysian Borneo, later in Japan, South Africa, St. Kitts as early as 2017, Gibraltar 2019. Galapagos, we just finished our first collection season this past August. And what this involved was a detailed survey that evolved over time as we moved from location to location. That included symptomology, health history, vaccination status, knowledge, attitudes, practices, environmental attitudes, risk-taking, all sorts of things. And like I said, the survey evolved over time, got more sophisticated, where we began relying on standardized, validated surveys for environmental attitudes and risk-taking, like the new ecological paradigm, the connectedness with nature, and other things. And this was so as to understand their general attitudes towards the environment, non-human animals in particular, not just what they're feeling while they're traveling, but in their day-to-day lives. Like I mentioned, this started for me at the Sepalak Orangutan Rehabilitation Center in Sabah, Malaysia. It's located underneath that blue dot right there. It was at the time the world's largest rehabilitation center for non-human primates, where orangutans, which are rescued off oil palm plantations, pet trade, and other places, they are brought there and taught how to feed for themselves, and then eventually released into the surrounding forest. It's open to tourists, 2 showings a day. I say showings because there's a large feeding on a separate platform that you can't see here. But it still allows for direct contact at times. There's lots of signage around that says, please don't touch the animals. But of course, orangutans, and as you see a pigtail macaque here, they can't read. So they don't follow the instructions. And obviously humans don't either. But what's ironic here is I took this picture, and that is the flyer that I created that said, please don't touch the monkeys. After that, obviously, different people travel to different places for different reasons, and human contact with non-human primates happens all around the world. Some places at greater frequency than others. One with a lot of frequency is throughout Japan, these monkey parks. Again, Jikokudani is probably the most famous for the onsens. I started working at outside of the city of Oita in the island of Kyushu is the Takasakiyama Monkey Park, which is home to several hundred Japanese macaques or snow monkeys, and people come daily throughout the day to mingle with these animals, especially for photo opportunities. I did my work, my doctoral work originally in Kibale Forest in Uganda. I knew that I wanted to return back to Africa somehow and study these things. So I actually ended up, I tried to work at the Cape of Good Hope outside of Cape Town because of all the Chakma baboon conflict with local human populations. Didn't get permission to do that, but ended up working at the Monkey Land Primate Sanctuary in Plettenberg Bay. It's in the Garden Route, quite beautiful part of the world. working at what is still the largest free-range primate sanctuary in the world. These are animals that are rescued from the pet trade primarily. It is open air, so you walk around. These animals are not caged or anything like that. However, there is a guide with you that discourages touching. Still happens. A little bit closer to home, to where I live now. I'm in Central Texas. This is a short flight away to St. Kitts in the West Indies. About 150 years ago, a population of African green monkeys, or vervets, were brought in for biomedical purposes, probably originally food, then used for biomedical purposes, and then just released on the islands. Between St. Kitts and Nevis, there's an estimated 60,000 of these animals still. Now, they are free range. However, the majority of human, non-human animal contact happens through, again, photo opportunities. These facilitated by individuals who will trap and hunt these animals, dispose of the mothers, keep the young ones, and raise them for photograph purposes. Then we went to Gibraltar. As I'm sure you know where it's at, between Spain and Morocco. It is a giant monolithic limestone feature that is home to the Barbary apes, or it's not an ape, obviously, it's Barbary macaque, and a very famous tourist site to interact with these animals. And then most recently, the Galapagos Islands. All of the aforementioned projects, the previous 5, had to deal with human and non-human primates. There aren't non-human primates on the Galapagos Islands. Okay, they don't have monkeys or apes there, but they do have an enormous amount of human animal conflict because of it is a biodiverse wonderland there, which of course can be a double-edged sword. So backing up to the beginning with our most basic surveys, this is back in 2008, 2009, looking at the Orangutan Rehabilitation Center in Malaysia. We had 1,287 surveys, you can see down here, so a decent sample size. One of the first things we note is that people don't understand their vaccination status. I mean, well before COVID, right? Carrying the only way to be sure was to carry around your card, and I'm sure that most of us on the Zoom right now don't carry our vaccine certificate with us when we travel internationally. And even when we do, we probably do not know how accurate it is at any given time. So what we can take away from this is that people tend to be under-vaccinated. We know that given the pandemic, right? Some of the interesting things that popped up, and I find these two, I will show you data from the other sites that also on these statements. They agreed that humans can get and give diseases from and to wild animals. Typically, the agreement for these statements very high, and that's great. You know, we want to see it 100%. We want, especially post-COVID, right? When people should have a better general understanding of what zoonotic diseases are. Hopefully they'll be at 100%. I'll tell you the answer is they're not. Despite the fact that it's so high here, the likelihood of wanting to touch or feed one of these animals is ridiculously high. So here's the juxtaposition. With the higher this number here, we should see a lower likelihood of wanting to touch, right? Because our common sense is telling us that we should not be doing that. But as you know, humans don't typically act well with common sense, right? So early observations, tourists are generally unprepared for travel. They're unprepared to get sick while they're traveling, and it's rare that there are health regulations at these ecotourism locations. They are found in some places. You know, for example, Volcanoes National Park, Rwanda does it probably better than anyone, but they are not ubiquitous. And even when these regulations exist and the signs are posted, they're not enforced. So, like any good aspect of science, doing some work led to more questions than answers. Questions at this point were, why are people willing to violate these regulations? Why do people want to participate in risky behaviors, specifically with wild animals? Okay. And do these reasons outweigh health behaviors and environmental awareness? So, with those new questions in hand, we set off to Japan, a very different population. Okay. Now, I'm intentionally not putting all of the results from these 6 different locations on a singular slide, because the results from one project I do not believe are comparable. We can't say, well, oh, the Japanese, they are much more likely to have an animal as a pet than, say, a different population. Okay. In other words, we're going to avoid the ecological fallacy. But looking within this particular cohort, a little bit smaller sample size, you could see that agreement with statements conducive with understanding zoonotic diseases lower here. I'm not going to imagine, try to explain this. But the main thing that came out of this part of the project was a list of the motivations that people had for contact with non-human primates in particular. And they are, as you would expect. They're cute, they're neotenized, they're juvenilized, they look like us, they behave like us. Importantly, you want contact with these animals and photographs with contact with these animals so that you can tell other people that you did it. That aspect of exhibitionism that is fulfilled through social media. But also, really important and a very frequent response was that they saw other people doing it. And not just other people, but sometimes professional primatologists, very famous primatologists, seen holding, touching, kissing these animals, and thus they think it's an appropriate behavior themselves. Taking what we learned from there and going to South Africa now, we're seeing higher agreement with these statements that you can get and give diseases from and to wild animals. At this point in time, we really became interested in pet ownership, primate pet ownership too. Again, because then Monkeyland Sanctuary is largely populated by animals that were obtained through the pet industry. In South Africa, it is illegal to own an indigenous species as a pet. Like, you can't have a lion, you can't have a chacma baboon, but you can have a capuchin or a gibbon, because they're not indigenous. So these animals grow up, people realize they can't take care of them, they need a forever home, and they go to places like this. So here, 10.4% would own a primate as a pet. If we back up to the Japanese sample, in Japan, I will tell you that 99% of those surveyed were local Japanese individuals. The response to that question about pet ownership was in the mid 30%, so about 34%, I believe. But also coming out of these data in South Africa was the idea that there are people that are particularly motivated to travel the world to interact specifically with wild primates. Okay, so in other words, they go to these destinations not as secondary. They're not necessarily in a country to do anything else except primarily have these types of interactions. And you get that a lot, like Malaysia. Malaysian Borneo, those were backpackers. They really were environmentally aware. But if we look at some of these other populations, and I'll get to in a moment, like Gibraltar and St. Kitts, they're primarily cruise ship passengers, there for very different reasons. So in this case, about 30% traveled to a different location, specifically to view wild primates. About 29% made aware of health regulations. Only about 15% thought that any of those regulations were enforced in any way. So more observations throughout this process. Perceived risk varies. It continues to be outweighed by desire to interact with wild animals, and current risk communication, both in situ at these locations, as well as online in preparation for travel, are inadequate. So, like I said, different people travel to different places for different reasons, and we wanted to look at cruise ship passengers. So we went to St. Kitts in the West Indies. And if we look at the data here, rather similar, a little bit low for get and give from and to wild animals, much higher likelihood of having touched. Okay? Reason being is that touching there is encouraged. Okay? Obviously, this leads to problems. Of this sample here, 30 people were bitten or scratched in front of us, sometimes while taking the survey. So yeah, the irony is thick with that one. And then also to bring it back to something that we've been documenting consistently at the other locations is that illness during travel is rather common. And through our samples, we have seen that number reporting at least one respiratory symptom while visiting these animal sanctuaries kind of varies anywhere between 9% and 50%. I won't go tangential too much, but on one project, we actually did throat swabs on 1,000 people visiting the orangutan sanctuary. And we found a viral prevalence of upper respiratory tract infection of about 7%. So yes, they're symptomatic and they are likely infectious. So from the St. Kitts data, that's when we started to try to explain better some of these juxtaposed behaviors. More positive environmental attitudes associated with greater desire to prevent disease transmission, that's great. But also, at the same time, more desire to touch or feed these animals. Okay? So in other words, our attitude is not matching our behavior. This is known as cognitive affective inconsistency. It's because these actions are emotionally rewarding. Sometimes we care about something, we care about it so much and too much that we hurt it, right? And in this case, it is a great example of how when we create educational material to try to stop some of these problems, that we don't rely on statistics to try to convince people to behave in better ways around these animals. We need to appeal to the emotions. Case studies on how certain animals have died as a result of this, they might be more effective. Gibraltar, we saw something very similar, reported having touched a little bit lower, 24%. 3.5% were bitten or scratched again while we were there. A little bit higher prevalence of likely respiratory infection. But the important thing out of this is that we found the same relationship between attitude and behavior. Different location, different people, different mix of people too. I'll tell you, the St. Kitts, 78% were from North America. So primarily American cruise ship passengers. Gibraltar, 80% European cruise ship passengers, different population. But we demonstrate the same thing, that more favorable environmental attitudes are associated with greater desire to touch. The more you're willing to do to protect these animals, that is to wear a mask, to disinfect your shoes, to not come in when you're sick, that was associated with greater desire to have direct physical contact with these animals. Okay, again, this attitude, behavior, incongruence. Loving something too much. As I mentioned, we just finished a field season in the Galapagos Islands, specifically the islands of Santa Cruz and San Cristobal, which of the 5 islands that have any human inhabitants. They're the 2 largest. Recovering from COVID, obviously still the pandemic, tourism is increasing. It was obviously closed down between 2020 and 2022. So tourism took a big hit, but it is rebounding right now. An important thing to note, really important thing to note, is that all the data on all the other 5 field sites were collected before the pandemic. These are the only data, the only field site, Galapagos, that were collected post-pandemic. So you would hope, right? You'd hope that agreement with statements consistent with understanding zoonotic disease and anthropozoonotic disease, that they would be high. In fact, they're not. This is the first time that we're also sampling tourists as well as local residents to understand some of the incongruence in these behaviors here. Yeah, you could comment on higher respiratory symptoms in the residents, but I don't think the sample size is large enough for that. We only got 846 people so far. But this is surprisingly, I thought this would be a lot higher post-pandemic. Rather disappointed. So why do we continue to see these things? Well, humans are really good at doing things that are bad for us, right? And when it comes to non-human animals, direct contact with species can be overridden, can override our sensibilities. Combined with loss of situational awareness and loss of inhibition during travel, it can lead to kind of a perfect storm of opportunities for contact. And contact can result in illness and injury, but also a spillover and spillback of pathogens. Social media is certainly not helping this situation at all, giving a platform for exhibitionism and social acceptance. I imagine the next steps for us are to create better educational materials for people that are tailored for each of these sites, because each of these sites are rather different. But importantly, try to communicate this information to travelers before they leave their home countries. So possibly pairing with those who are much better at social media than I am in trying to solve some of these problems. So I appreciate your time and listening to me on this nice Friday morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Feel free to raise your hand. We're going to start with one question in the chat from Robert Shopler. Robert, did you want to ask that yourself, or should I go ahead with it?
I'm happy to sort of revise it a little bit. Just wondering if your instrument had anything to address either the function of media in influencing people's attitudes towards wildlife, or if you had anything with zoos. And I'm kind of interested to know if zoos do more protection or actually get people to think, oh, caged animals, wild animals is a good idea, I could have one.
That is a very interesting question. I will tell you that for first part, no. We only collect information in terms of motivation, and the only time regarding media. And that's the only time that is asked in this rather extensive survey. We're approaching, over 100 multi-part questions. It takes a good 40 minutes to complete now. But if I was to add anything, that would certainly be at the top of the list. We do have questions about zoo attendance. We don't find any relationship with that right now. That wasn't part of the original survey. It is part of the more recent one. But even better, we've got extensive history on pet ownership and livestock ownership. And so, yes, if you are more likely to have exotic pets in particular, or grow up around livestock, you tend to be more willing to take risks around wild animals as well. I will tell you that we have conducted similar surveys at the San Antonio Zoo and the Gladys Porter Zoo in Brownsville, the border with Mexico. But those data are not analyzed. So I see the logic behind your statement. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Feel free to raise your hands. I had a question for Michael. I'm just curious if there's evidence of human to primate transfer of disease at any of the sites that you worked at, or perhaps more importantly, if that would really be noticed, if there's monitoring going on for that.
Exactly. Okay. So to answer your first question, part of the question, yeah, it is yes. We know that this happens. We don't know the frequency in which it happens because it is not monitored. It is not monitored because it's rather expensive to do, right? And if we did it, getting results back in real time would be difficult unless we had labs on site. But yes, it actually started, all this work in Malaysian Borneo started with wanting to know what pathogens the orangutans had and the macaques. And so we were looking at the development of vivax malaria from non-human primate malarias, among other things. So we're sampling the animals. And then we turned to sampling the humans. And I mentioned that one project looking at respiratory tract infection. For one, it is difficult to document because of lack of monitoring, but two, it's also difficult because you need to genotype the pathogen here. You can't identify an influenza virus, para-influenza, for example, that in humans and non-human primates at the same location and say that they're actually connected. They could be completely different infections unassociated with one another. But yes, we do know that it happens. I do not know the frequency. I'll give one example. Tattooed on my arm here is an orangutan named Mowgli. Okay, he was rescued off an oil palm plantation. I raised him a little bit for a few weeks. He was later used in a zoo in Kota Kinabalu, Malaysia, as one of these ambassador animals that you take around, and people aren't supposed to hold them, but yeah, they end up doing that for photos. He died of what is suspected to be human influenza from one of those encounters. I would like to understand the likelihood of transmission better, absolutely. However, I think that our efforts are best spent at doing our best to change human behavior rather than pathogen discovery. And obviously, changing human behavior is probably a lot harder, right? But we know that that's probably going to lead to a more immediate outcome.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Michael. I always thought that the best motivator in humans was fear. I mean, is there any hope of making people afraid by showing them examples of, you know, what can happen to them and or the primates?
Sure. When we look at health communication, disaster communication, for example, you can appeal to logic or fear, and fear does work. It can backfire on you. For example, when 2005 avian influenza outbreak was in full swing, there were a lot of individuals shooting migratory birds, not understanding that these birds had avian influenza the whole time, you know, for probably millions of years. So especially in local communities that live around these sanctuaries or with wild primates, it is rather easy to convince them to eliminate the animals instead. And that's problematic because you can get these individuals working against your mission. I will also tell you, Bernie, one thing that we're looking into that seems to be most effective is shaming people. Yeah, I don't really want to be in the business of shaming people, right? But this is like one of the mechanisms by how you increase recycling behaviors in neighbors is you're calling them out as being divergent in behaviors that are best for the community.
Right, get the people to self-police.
Exactly.
We have a question from Randy Nessie. Randy?
Yeah, hi, Michael and Bernie. I'm so glad to hear this research. I didn't know you were doing all of these projects, Michael. And it's especially welcome because I've been curious my whole career. One of my very best friends spent a couple of years living with baboons, came back with chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's really harmed her entire life.
Yeah.
And it's just been and so people need to know about these things. But my question is just like Bernie's really. I mean, people don't respond very well to facts. In the abstract. Has anyone done studies demonstrating that, for instance, the cruise ship that docked at St. Kitts led to increased rates of illness in people in the subsequent week? I think, a project that actually documented that bad things happen to people who hang out with wild animals would be very dramatic and newsworthy.
It would, right? I've actually thought about trying to pair up with the cruise ship industry because things like norovirus, right?
Yeah.
Those which are transmitted from non-human primates, are not necessarily respiratory things that spread that quickly. In ideal world, it's not ideal to make anybody sick, obviously, but to demonstrate something like this using a pathogen that is mild but significant and transmits rapidly. So, thinking upper respiratory tract infection, these kind of things. That type of transmission typically happens from humans to non-human primates, not vice versa. Not to say that it's not possible, but yeah, I agree that it would be nice towards a contribution of animal conservation and human preservation if we were able to demonstrate something that's significant. I think it would require a great deal more monitoring than what we're doing.
You have a question from Charlie Nunn. Charlie?
Great talk, Michael. Really enjoyed hearing about that. I had no idea you'd done as much as you have done. I knew about some of the early work and didn't realize that was still a part of your research program. The advocates of One Health often make the point that interdisciplinarity is so key to One Health approaches. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about interdisciplinarity and the research you're doing in terms of the team you have, or just in general, where you think the most important interdisciplinary connections lie and should be formed in this work on ecotourism and health.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, again, it was a side project that grew wild, right? And kind of just kept going, but it kept me in the field and not just in the laboratory, which keeps me happy. I could not accomplish any of this without working with at least two different groups. I got into travel medicine, I don't know, back in about 2010, and I organized a symposium at the International Society for Ecology and Health in Merida, Mexico, and brought in, just happenstance, a guy named Robert Steffen. He turns out to be basically the father of travel medicine. He was in Zurich, he's retired now. But I did not, some of the early questions that I had on the surveys were not based on adequate research on my part. I was essentially reinventing the wheel to a certain degree. And I admit my faults in this. I later compensated, I believe, by establishing those relationships with the International Society for Travel Medicine, in which trying to get the people who prepare travelers to go overseas to start communicating this type of information. And we did, and there's a study that I didn't mention on here where we did a survey of the 1,600 members of the International Society for Travel Medicine. And a vast majority of responses when talking about preparing people for contact with animals, non-human animals, was almost exclusively in the context of rabies. So there's room for us to learn from the field of travel medicine, but also for us to help them do their jobs more effectively. Another group that I am fortunate to work with are some environmental and social psychologists. I'm not trained in psychology. I'm trained in tropical medicine and immunology. So I was unable to adequately explain, use the appropriate terminology for this juxtaposition between knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors without involving that group. Again, something that I wish I would have done a lot earlier. But yeah, I'm not able to accomplish anything without a very diverse team of experts.
We have a question from Kristen Snapkowski. Kristen?
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk, and I was just wondering a little bit, you mentioned in St. Kitts that people are sort of encouraged to touch the animals, and I was wondering a little bit about how you feel sort of the encouragement or the expectation that people don't touch the animals coming from the actual sanctuary or whatever from it by itself, like how that's influencing people's perceptions of the risks. And if your research has made any efforts to try to change some of the rules at these areas where they're encouraging people to touch the animals.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I need to clarify. In St. Kitts, it's not an animal sanctuary where we collect data. We collect data on the beach at two very popular beach bars. They're actually the most popular spot. When the cruise ships they dock, there's that shopping area in front, like there is in most places in the Caribbean. And then tourists are typically bused to the other side of the island where they hang out in this beautiful beach. It's there, as well as at the dock, where there are these monkey men. They're called monkey men. And they are there trying to convince you to take a photograph with these animals. Sometimes they'll just put the animal on you and then require money to take the animal off. It is not endorsed by any location that we surveyed. It is not endorsed by the local government, but it's kind of where they turn a blind eye. They understand that these individuals are trying to feed their families, and they need to have creative ways, especially on an island where it costs a fortune to have things shipped in and you can't grow most things yourself. So that is kind of a unique situation there. In the other places, they are typically monitored with regulations clearly posted, and it's that which I think is most problematic, because despite being clearly posted and despite staff members being peppered throughout, these interactions still happen. So in other words, despite our best efforts under some circumstances. So yeah, apples and oranges kind of thing.
I had one additional question for you, Michael, if that's all right.
Please.
The other main context that we know has led to issues has been the wet markets and buying live animals for food, and that is part of the culture of the countries involved. And I'm just wondering about people's attitudes concerning wet markets. I mean, I think they were outlawed after the first SARS outbreak, but that didn't work. I mean, it's a little bit similar in that it involves human culture interacting with animals and disease transmission. Do we know anything about people's attitudes towards buying live animals in wet markets, and that has led to what we know has been major disasters?
Sure, right. I mean, obviously the original SARS, they're what wet markets in, for example, in Hong Kong, they were shut down, but then they were just opened up right at the on the outskirts of Hong Kong, right? Wet markets are primarily used by local residents. So yes, there are cultural expectations and taboos. And from what I've read, I have not worked with individuals visiting wet markets, but colleagues that do, and I've spoken to about this, you know, a lot of times that type of shopping, that type of wild food is preferred. So it is embedded in culture, and it's going to be very difficult to stop. Very difficult. Now, the role of tourists in association with wet markets, I haven't thought about that, Bernie. You know, so the only time I've ever seen tourists visit wet markets, I'll tell you, was in Malaysia. I think that would be very interesting to look at. Also, the first time that we are really focusing on the knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of local people is just now this last field season in the Galapagos. So I do think it would be really important to incorporate that local indigenous perspective and how it is juxtaposed from those tourists.
Thank you. Johnny, question?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'll try to ask this one quickly because it's very broad, but I've been, my wife and I actually were at that orangutan sanctuary in Sandakan in Sabah.
Yeah.
It was
All right.
awesome. So my first impression when I was there was like, wow, this is really well done. This is ecotourism proper. And then on my way back on those long boardwalks, two orangutans were walking right on the boardwalk, and we were forced, we're forced to like just not move, and they actually brushed up on us, and it was there's no way to avoid it. And I thought that was like, wow, my naive self didn't think they could interact, but they sure could, and they did. So like, and that's got like severe consequences for orangutan conservation. It's such a positive thing, but what would be an ideal ecotourist setup? I mean, it's almost like, how do you, people are going to do what people do, but how do you prevent them from maybe potentially exposing?
Sure. And we ask in the survey, what are people willing to do? And we give lots of different examples.
Yeah.
And of course, the more environmentally you are, the more connectedness with nature, the more things you're willing to do, including, give a saliva sample or even a blood sample, these kind of things. An ideal situation, complete separation between humans and wildlife. I mean, but is that going to happen? No. Okay. What we were able to do at Sepalak at the time was get funds to put in hand washing stations. Some of them, especially the Jane Goodall sanctuaries, they will typically also do a shoe sanitation, so just a little bleach water, and then also masking. I mean, what's the name? I forget the name of the one that is small island off of Entebbe in Uganda. It's a Jane Goodall sanctuary, and they were requiring masks back in 2001. So we know that masks are effective, right, if they're worn properly and it's the type of mask. Now you introduced two issues. One, who's qualified working at these sanctuaries to make sure that all of this is done properly? Okay. And two, you're going to be generating a lot of medical waste now. How do you get rid of it? Right. But, best case scenario, if we can't separate humans and wildlife, would be to mask up. And then, another one too would be to simply do not come in if you are sick or symptomatic. And now that is advertised at a number of places, like I mentioned in Volcanoes National Park, Rwanda. But we know that people will still go into these sanctuaries, even if they're told you can't come in if you're sick. They will hide their illness. We know this happens. Okay. Think about going somewhere and spending $10,000 to get there and stay there, and you're not feeling well. You've got a really bad cough that you got on the airplane or whatnot. Are you really not going to go? Right. I mean, you shouldn't. Right. Your knowledge is telling you that you shouldn't, but your attitude is, well, I deserve to be here. I'll never have the chance to do it again. And so the behavioral outcome is poor.
I absolutely agree. Thank you.
All right, we are coming up on the hour. If you wanted to join me in thanking Michael for a fascinating talk.
Thanks, everybody.
And we'll see you all next time at Club Ev Med.
Thanks, Bernie. Thanks, Michael.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. It's great to see everybody.
Thank you.